Thank you to everybody for joining us today for our panel, Holding Elections During the Pandemic. I'm Shauna Huey, president of Think Tennessee. To those of you who are learning about Think Tennessee for the first time, we're a nonpartisan, statewide think tank focused on empowering voters and increasing family economic security. More information about our work is available at thinktennessee.org. So the turnout for today's event is fantastic. We've got more than 150 folks participating right now. That includes mayors and legislators and their staff, along with election officials, members of the media, and voters from across the state. I think it's a real testament, actually, to the interest that our state has in finding a way to ensure that Tennesseans are able to cast their ballot this year without risking their health. And it's not lost on any of us that last presidential election, our state ranked 49th nationally for voter turnout. So we feel like this is a particularly important conversation to be having this year. So as you'll see on your screen, we've got a great panel of national experts. We're going to weigh in. I'll introduce them in just a second. But together, over the next hour, we'll explore how the threat of the coronavirus may evolve this fall and why solutions like temporarily expanding absentee voting may be necessary to protect voters this year. We'll also discuss the perceptions of voters who have growing worries about contracting the coronavirus and widely support options beyond in-person voting. And we'll close with a first look at some new research that Think Tennessee is releasing today about the feasibility and cost of temporarily expanding absentee voting in Tennessee. I'm so grateful to each of the panelists today for joining us. I'm going to take a second and introduce each of them briefly. So first, we've got Dr. Alex Jahangir. He's chair of the National Coronavirus Task Force, as part of which he's tasked with leading our city's response to the pandemic. Dr. Jahangir is also chair of the Metropolitan Board of Health. He's a professor of orthopedic surgery and an orthopedic trauma surgeon at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and he serves as associate chief of staff at Vanderbilt University Hospital and as the director for the Division of Orthopedic Trauma at VUMC. Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes is here with us today, and we'll hear all about it in just a moment, but he was deeply involved in that state's effort to postpone their recent primary elections. Lieutenant Governor Barnes is the first African-American to serve as lieutenant governor. He was born and raised in Milwaukee. At age 25, he was elected to serve in the Wisconsin State Assembly, where he served 2 terms. In his current role, the lieutenant governor has focused on increasing opportunities for every child, person, in Wisconsin, regardless of zip code. Now, as you all may have seen, Wisconsin Supreme Court just overturned that state's stay-at-home order. So the lieutenant governor will have to leave us right after his remarks, but we're so grateful that he's here today. Next up, we've got former Secretary of State Trey Grayson. Secretary of State Grayson is currently a partner at Frost, Brown & Todd, which has offices here in Nashville. He served 2 terms as Kentucky's Secretary of State, and he was the youngest Secretary of State in the nation at the time of his election. He was chair of the Republican Association of Secretaries of State and president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. He was the first Kentuckian to hold either position. Right now, he's a member of the National Task Force on Election Crises, which is a highly respected cross-partisan organization that's working to ensure a free and fair 2020 presidential election. And finally, we've got Jeff Horwit from Hart Research Associates. He's a vice president there and a pollster where he works on a variety of projects, including polls for NBC News and the Wall Street Journal. He's a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal's Think Tank blog, which provides analysis from policy and political thinkers. Before we get started, a few logistical notes. 1, we're recording this event today so that we can share it with those who weren't able to attend. And 2, we'll save some time for questions at the end. So if you're thinking of a question and you've got one for the group, please enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started. Dr. Jahangir, we're going to start with you. As chair of Nashville's Coronavirus Task Force and the Nashville Board of Health, you are leading citywide efforts to respond to the pandemic. What can you tell us about the potential for health concerns this fall?
Well, so thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel with this great group. You know, I think what we all know in any community in which we live in now is that COVID-19 is unreal, right? I don't think any of us could have envisioned what we've all been through just 6 months ago even. And one of the biggest things that we all have probably come to terms with is the new normal, as everyone's calling it, is going to be that way until there is a vaccine. And a vaccine in the best case scenario is 18 months away. And then you have to be able to distribute that vaccine to everyone. And so because of that, I think we need to look in an 18 to 24 month period for any planning, whether it's opening schools or opening colleges or scheduling elections. Because I think if we don't do that, public health is at risk. And so what I'm really proud of the response here in Nashville and in Tennessee, we really have done great at testing capacity. We've done great at kind of flattening the curve. And now we need to continue that, especially as our state and our city reopen. And part of that is planning on how do we protect our most medically vulnerable and our elderly. And those are populations that I think, regarding this topic especially, it's very important to make sure that we think through that and make plans in such a way that we can protect voting and protect our most vulnerable populations in the age of COVID until that vaccine is found.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jahangir. Now we will turn it over to the Lieutenant Governor. Lieutenant Governor, you had a front row seat to the recent Wisconsin primaries. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. Again, I'm Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, and always excited to talk about democracy and how we can make it more accessible, especially at a time where we desperately need to make that happen so that we can function more effectively as a people. And as you likely know, we were the only state in the country to have, or who didn't postpone our April election or convert to an all absentee election. And this wasn't just the presidential primary in Wisconsin. I know a lot of times when that election gets mentioned, they just talk about the fact that there was a presidential primary. That just happened to be on the ballot. It was our state Supreme Court race and also local elections took place all across Wisconsin. And, unlike other states, our election rules are written into state law. And our legislature wasn't necessarily interested in moving our election, as many called for, including the governor. And there wasn't an interest in expanding access to absentee voting. And we already have no excuse absentee voting here in Wisconsin, but nobody was planning for a pandemic. So our local governments who administer the elections didn't have the capacity to meet the increased demand that we saw for absentee ballots. And in many instances, people's ballots weren't getting sent to them. One of the leaders in the legislature did not get his ballot until after the election, and he didn't vote because he didn't want to go in person and put his family at risk. And so, people needed to get a witness signature, which is not super easy if you're isolating at home, especially if you live by yourself. And as things grew more dire and we got closer to election day, the governor took action and ordered the election to be postponed until June. Unfortunately, the state Supreme Court overturned that and they ordered the election to continue in person, which put lives at risk. And there have been a number of people who test positive for COVID-19 who went to vote in person. And the U.S. Supreme Court also overturned a lower court's decision that extended the deadline for returning those absentee ballots. So a lot of people were disenfranchised throughout the whole ordeal. This left voters who weren't able to request an absentee ballot in time, or those who didn't receive their ballot in the mail, they had the impossible choice of whether they were going to sacrifice their health or discard their right to vote. And so due to huge shortages of poll workers, the city of Milwaukee, which normally has 180 polling locations, went down to 5. And the city of Green Bay had only 2 when they normally have 31. People waited until after midnight in some instances to cast their ballot. There were some weather conditions going on. There was rain, there was hail, and there were people, again, who didn't wait at all because they decided that it wasn't worth risking their lives. And this is something that should have never happened. And this is clearly something that should never happen again, not just in our state, but any state. All the turmoil and the disenfranchisement, it was preventable. The suffering of the 67 people who contracted COVID-19 after voting in person or working the polls, that was preventable. But states have to start planning now. And the last minute court actions and the constant changing of the rules in the days leading up to our election, it created unnecessary chaos. It created confusion And chaos and confusion are inherently tools of voter suppression in and of itself. But again, if states start now, which I strongly encourage them to do so, my own state included, we can be able to plan for the worst. We can make ourselves more resilient and offer more opportunities for people to exercise their constitutional right. Absentee voting, we know, is popular, it's effective, multiple states already do it, and best of all, it ensures that we can keep democracy operating in a time where we desperately need it to. So all that to say, it's about leadership, and it's about recognizing the need to do the right thing, then going ahead and doing the right thing. So thank you so much for having me. I will say just quickly, I spent a lot of time in Nashville. So I went to school in Alabama. I went to Alabama A&M. So just a 90-minute ride. Lots of weekends in Nashville. Want to throw it out there. No stranger to the state.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time in the midst of all that is happening in your own state right now, Lieutenant Governor. We really appreciate your time. For media on the call that may have questions for the Lieutenant Governor, we'll be happy to connect you later on. But in the meantime, Lieutenant Governor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, Secretary of State Grayson, I'm going to turn it over to you. As a two-term Secretary of State for Kentucky and a current member of the National Task Force on Election Crises, you know a thing or two about protecting elections. So tell us a little bit, if you will, about solutions that you have seen work in Kentucky and other southern states as well.
Thanks, Shauna. It's great to be with you, all of you. I put a little orange into my shirt just to kind of, show respect for the folks in Tennessee from your northern neighbors in Kentucky. Also want to give a shout out. One of my friends from college, Jeff Yarbrough, the state senator from Nashville, I saw him on the participant list. He texted me and told me I better not embarrass him. So I'm doing so. I'm glad he's on here. Yeah, I do still work a lot in elections. In addition to the task force, I'm on the board of a couple of nonprofits. And going into this year, this was, election security was something we were really thinking a lot about and trying to figure out how to run elections and make sure that the votes are kept safe. And then now we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic. And so in Kentucky and in other states, I've talked with the election administrators to try to help figure that out. In my home state of Kentucky, we were informed by watching other states. We're lucky. Our primary was actually supposed to be next Tuesday. It's our traditional time in the middle of May. We do not do an early presidential preference primary. We do everything at one time in May. And in early March, we started seeing what was going on. We saw what happened in Wisconsin and Ohio. And so our election officials, our government leaders, both in the legislative branch and executive branch, came together to try to address the situation. 15 years earlier, when I was Secretary of State, we actually passed a law to put in place the ability to postpone an election. We did this in the wake of, in 2004, remember there was a terrorist act in Spain, and it was right around the time of the election. 9/11 took place on an election day, which required the New York primary to be postponed. And so a lot of us around the country tried to put these laws into place. And so when we passed that law in a bipartisan way, it allowed the governor, upon the recommendation of the Secretary of State, to postpone an election about a month. And that's really all it said. It didn't get into the details other than saying the State Board of Elections could promulgate regulations. So one thing we had to deal with was, what is the power under that? It's clear you can postpone an election, and the governor and the Secretary of State did that, and everybody was on board. Yes, let's go ahead and postpone it. So we postponed the primary from the 19th of May to the 23rd of June. But then how do you actually conduct an election in a pandemic? To be honest, that was not something that we thought about back then when we passed this law. Arguably, the law gave the power to change the manner of voting, but it wasn't clear. So the legislature passed a law. We were still in session with an emergency order that said during an emergency, the governor and the Secretary of State can agree on how to conduct an election and how to change the manner of the election. And that made it clear that we could broaden our absentee rules to allow an excuse for COVID-19 to allow you to vote by mail absentee or in person by absentee. Unlike Tennessee, and I've always been really jealous, we don't have true early voting. You'll always have to have an excuse to vote absentee, whether it's in person or by mail. Something I tried to work on when I was Secretary of State, and I always touted Tennessee and said, look, if Tennessee can do this and do it successfully, we ought to do it too. We still don't have that. But in that time of an emergency, when they come together, we could do that. So the law was passed. It was not that controversial. And I do want to note, our governor is a Democrat. Our Secretary of State's a Republican. Our legislature is all Republican with big majorities. I mean, I shouldn't say all Republican. There's Democrats in the legislature, but it's super majorities for Republicans in both houses. And this bill was part of something else. So there were other things that legislators voted on, but it was overwhelmingly passed. And last, I guess about 2 weeks ago, the state passed a rule. So here's how it works in Kentucky. And I'd say more broadly, you got to think about what is your state's tradition? How do you conduct absentee voting and in-person, election day voting? Because that can help inform what is the art of possible. You also have to look at the politics and the timing. How much time do you have until our election? So we are rushing to try to run a very different kind of election next month, but you still have to request an absentee ballot. So the state is sending a postcard to every registered voter in Kentucky to say, hey, we've changed the rules to allow you to vote absentee. Here's a website, go click here and submit your request, and they'll send you the application. You've signed it, it's already filled out. And then you'll get your ballot sent to you in the mail, and then you can either drop it off or mail it back. We are still going to have in-person voting for those who need that. And that's also, I think, an important part of this. Not everybody can and should vote absentee through a paper ballot via the mail. And so some people need to vote in person. And so we are going to offer that opportunity, and counties are able to expand that. They're trying to do it by appointment. We'll see how that works. But that's an attempt to basically let people vote the way they need to vote in the middle of a pandemic. Now, our solution only applies right now to the primary. It's quite likely we'll be under a state of emergency in November, but then the governor and the Secretary of State would have to come together again on rules for November. So we're waiting to see how the primary goes in Kentucky. The reality is that we don't have time to think much about November. We got to get ready for May. Some of the work, some of the procedures, some of the investments of money, we're using federal dollars that were given in the last couple of years for security purposes, as well as in the CARES Act. We're allocating those dollars to help pay the postage for these postcards and for the ballots and the applications. So, I don't know what the November election is going to look like. I don't know what kind of where we're going to be with the pandemic, but I was really proud of my state to come together. And we're starting to see, unfortunately, a little bit of a divide on some of these issues. And there's a nice opportunity. I know Tennessee's got its legislators coming back into session, so potentially there could be a law change. But I would say if for some reason the laws don't change, this is where everybody needs to set up. If Tennessee has to go into this election with the traditional rules, we're going to need more poll workers. We're going to need new places to vote. And so and we're also going to need to communicate the existing rules. Everybody over 60 can get a ballot in Tennessee. Not everybody knows that. And so I think it's incumbent upon everybody in Tennessee, once the rules are settled, to make sure that you work together. We go into this election with the rules that we have and the traditions that we have, not necessarily the way we want them to be, and we want them to be successful. So please, regardless of what happens with any policy changes, wouldn't it be good if you could get some, at least temporarily, let's work with a local election administrators, the Secretary of State, and everybody else to get this election to be conducted as best as it can for Tennessee. And that advice applies in every state that we're talking to and working with.
Well, thank you, Secretary, so much. We're going to turn it over to Jeff Corwitt. So Jeff, you represent a leading Democratic polling firm, and you partnered with Public Opinion Strategies, which is a leading Republican polling firm, to produce a recent Wall Street Journal NBC News poll. And I was hoping you could tell us just a little bit about what that poll shows.
Great. Thank you, Shauna. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with everybody. And again, my name is Jeff Hart. I'm the Senior Vice President at Hart Research, and we do a bipartisan poll for NBC News and the Wall Street Journal. This is the 30th year of the poll. And our Republican partner on the poll is Public Opinion Strategies, as Shauna mentioned. And what I'm going to be walking through some of the results from that poll, along with some other research, which really underscores the point here that, in 2020, expanding absentee voting really is both a voting rights issue to make sure people are enfranchised and have the right to vote however they feel safely to do so. And it's also really a public health issue, as Dr. Jahanger also touched on as well. So with that, let me just start here with some of our results from our recent poll. And The first thing here is just some table setting to understand where voters were. This was a year out. So this was in last October. And what we did here is we're looking at interest in the election, which is a powerful indicator, not the only indicator of actual intention to vote. And so what you can see here in the light blue is interest in the election in mid-October of 2016, so right before the election. And in the dark blue, what you see is interest in voting in the 2020 election a year out from election day. And across the board for most groups, younger people are a little bit of an exception here, but you're seeing interest a year out from 2020 being on par already with mid-October in 2016, a couple weeks out from the election. And so, look, it was imperative for our voting systems to be in place and working really well in a normal time, and because of what we expect to be historic levels of turnout in 2020. It's even more imperative now when we're in the middle of a pandemic and likely to be facing some sort of second wave issues in November. And the other point here is, look, this is not a partisan thing here in terms of turnout, making access to voting something that people can do easily and safely. Look at Democrats and Republicans, interest is really on par here. And you can also see among independents, which would normally there's a little bit of a gap there. It's not as much of a gap for 2020 as it was in 2016. So turning to the public health side of things, these numbers just are really, we get 3/4 of anyone saying they agree with something in America today. That tells you that this is a really powerful number. And you have 73% of Americans, or voters, who are saying that they're worried that they or someone in their family will catch the coronavirus, and that's a little bit higher even in the South. And so that points to a real concern that people have about how their life could be impacted. And on the public health side of this, then you also look at the proportion of Americans and those in the South who say that they have a household member with an underlying medical condition, which would, if they were to acquire COVID-19, would really put them in danger, as we're learning sadly on a daily basis. So that's 59% in the South. And then among Americans who are 65 and older, who we know make up a majority of poll workers, they are more likely to say that someone in their household, 60% have an underlying medical condition, including 31% of themselves who say that that's the case for them. So when we're talking not just for people who are showing up to vote, but who are doing the actual work, the essential workers who we're all learning in various sectors how important they are today, who are often overlooked, including poll workers, that they themselves, like other essential workers, are more likely to be at risk than others. And this is not a theoretical thing. This is not just a worry or a concern. We've seen that even in the last couple of months, there has been, this is research, the other research I'm setting throughout here is from NBC and the Wall Street Journal polling. This is from a Navigator tracking polling. And here, you have 3 in 10 Americans who are now saying that they personally know someone who's been infected with coronavirus. So this is real, something that people are feeling. And there's been a big jump since late March. And so it goes to people's comfort, the impact here, and we have 82% who say that they're avoiding public events and gatherings in response to COVID-19. Well, guess what? Voting in person is a public event. It's a gathering. And we saw from what Lieutenant Governor Barnes talked about how when you get people in a gathering, there are numbers of people who have unfortunately acquired COVID-19 because of that. We're also seeing some of our private polling that when we ask people their comfort level with voting in person, it is significantly lower than voting absentee or voting by mail, given circumstances. And then the last point I want to make here is looking at our question that we asked in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll is just supporting and this was broadly voting by mail, but I think it also holds for absentee voting, is support for this. And we asked this two different ways. One is we said, do you generally support voting by mail? And that's initially 58% said that they favor this. But then when we asked, okay, for those who oppose in general, we say as a follow-up, okay, well, given the circumstances of coronavirus and what the country is facing, would you favor it just for this election? This is what I think a little bit what Secretary of State Grayson was touching on, is that we need to adjust for the times that we're in, not just react blindly to what may have been the case in the past. And when you take that into account, that jumps up to a supermajority. 67% say that they would support expanding voting access here. And again, this is true for nearly 9 in 10 Democrats, nearly 7 in 10 independents. And while that drops to 44% for Republicans, it's worth noting here that within Republicans, there are two groups of Republicans and that we identify in our polling, and they split the Republican Party down the middle here. There are Republicans who identify more with Donald Trump and Republicans who identify more with the Republican Party. And among those who identify more with the Republican Party, they also favor this expansion by 58% to 41%. So again, I think we're a lot of data here that shows people, across the country and in the South are really worried about COVID-19's impact, not just broadly on other people, but on them, and how that could really have an impact on voting and the ability to get to cast ballots in November if there is not an expansion in access to voting.
Jeff, thank you so much. That's really informative. The graphics are extremely helpful. Certainly seeing a bipartisan support for some solutions here. So we're getting all sorts of great questions in our Q&A box. Just a reminder to the folks on the call today, if you've got questions for our panelists, please feel free to share them through that Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. And before we turn to some questions, I'm going to take just a second to run through some new research that Think Tennessee is releasing today. So we've got some graphics that I want to make sure y'all can see. So here we've got a new report again available on the Think Tennessee website called Voting During a Pandemic. We will make sure that all of you get a copy of this in your email after the call. So just a few different highlights here. You see some maps in the first graphic. This election year, Tennessee is one of just a handful of states that will require most voters to appear in person in order to cast a ballot. So we've been talking a lot today about some of the risks that are attendant to that. But we think it's important for folks to understand that today in our country, 2/3 of states already allow every voter to cast an absentee ballot in every election. They don't need an excuse to do that. Now, of the states where you do need an excuse, most of them have taken steps to expand absentee voting, at least during the pandemic. But here in Tennessee, we haven't seen that yet. So some new information that's out that we're putting out today is about federal funding. We heard Secretary of State Grayson talk a little bit about how Kentucky used some of its CARES Act funding to make some new investments. So our numbers out today show that Tennessee has about $55 million in federal elections funding that's available to make new investments in Tennessee elections. Now, of course, there's other investments that are really important as well, like protecting election security, investing in new voting machines. But of that 55 million, 9.5 million of it must be spent on pandemic-related increases in election funding. So that's that CARES Act spending, or that CARES Act funding. And numbers show that we've got $55 million, some of which needs to be spent on pandemic-related expenses. Think Tennessee took a look at how much it would cost to temporarily expand absentee voting just for the November election. And so that's this final graphic here. And what it shows that, assuming typical voter turnout in the presidential election, and then also assuming that every one of those voters would vote absentee, which we know is sort of an overestimate because, as Secretary of State Grayson mentioned, probably not every voter will vote absentee, but even assuming that they did, we estimate those costs for expanding absentee voting in November to be about $19.2 million. So again, we will we'll send that stuff around. We'll send those documents around after our call here, but wanted you all to have the first look at some of that information. Now, of course, in a normal year, most Tennesseans don't vote absentee. In fact, our absentee voter turnout hovers around 2%. But we all know that this is not a normal year. And just some numbers from Wisconsin to help folks understand what a huge uptick in absentee voting we might expect to see. So in Wisconsin, which again is a no excuse absentee state, they typically get about 200,000 requests for absentee ballots. For this year's election, they got more than 1 million requests for absentee voting. And so, again, this year, it's just not a typical election year. We just saw from Jeff that voters across the political spectrum really have indicated that they want to be able to choose the voting option that feels safest for them and for their families this year. And at Think Tennessee, we certainly believe that temporarily expanding absentee voting is an important part of the solution. So that's what we're going to keep working on. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us today. We are going to go ahead and turn it over to some questions. And I will just take a look here. We've got Senator Briggs, State Senator Briggs is joining us today. Thank you so much, Senator, for joining us. He's got a question that I think Secretary Grayson is probably best mentioned for you. And the senator was wondering about the security of absentee ballots. How do you make sure that they're secure, that they don't get lost in the mail or otherwise misplaced? And he was wondering if you could discuss just some of the security, the way that you make sure that absentee voting is secure.
Sure. Thanks, Senator, for these questions. I see them in the Q&A window. Let me start with first. The Kentucky Secretary of State, Mike Adams, and I, this is kind of an interesting story. In early May, we're on a talk show in Kentucky, and we were asked about vote by mail as a permanent reform. This was really this is right about a week before I think we all realized the world changed, I guess is the easiest way to describe it. And he and I, and along with a Democratic Secretary of State, former Democratic Secretary of State from Kentucky, were on the show, and we all said, we're not big fans of this. We're now big fans of this in a pandemic, but these questions get at some of the reasons and some of the concerns that some have. So with security, there's a couple of elements. So one is, things do get lost in the mail. We know that. So that's why a lot of the states who have expanded this form of absentee voting have given the ability to do a drop-off box. So one of the things in Kentucky that we're doing is for purchasing a box that can be used, not a little small ballot box, but like a big size. Think about the book where you return your book at a library, a big, hulking thing, but we're not going to put it outside because we know somebody might, wrap a chain around it and drive it away. So in Kentucky, we're putting it inside in the courthouse so people can manually deliver their ballots, wearing whatever the CDC guidelines, the masks and social distancing, but you can turn it in. And that's one way to address some of the mail concerns. You can do that in the short run. States that have a more robust vote by mail program, like Colorado and others, they actually have a tracking program so you can watch, the application has been received, the ballot has been sent, the ballot has been received, the eligibility has been determined. Yes, you're eligible, the ballot was filled out, the process correctly, and your vote counted. And so there are software programs that you can do that. There are barcodes. You still keep the anonymity of the ballot, but there's ways to be transparent about that process. The signature verification is pretty important. And so there's training on how to look at a signature. There's also technology that can be used to scan a signature and say, we're pretty confident that this is correct signature, move on. These we're not so sure about. And then human eyes can look at it. You're hearing a lot of things you're going to have to change procedures. Tennessee does this, as you said, Sean, at 2%. But when you're counting 2% of the ballots this way versus 20%, 40%, 60 or higher, everything's got to be a lot more thorough. You're going to need technology. You're probably also depending upon, and this is, I don't know what Tennessee tradition, in Kentucky, the political parties are very involved in observation of the process, the vote count process. And so you have to make sure with the media, the political parties, the campaigns, what level of observation or transparency are you going to have with the count so that people feel confident in this. The North Carolina question, that's something called ballot harvesting, which has been controversial, which allows people to collect absentee ballots and deliver them. It is one of the concerns that people have. When you take voting away from a polling place where you have poll workers, you have other voters watching, you do have the potential for some things to take place. And that's why some people in a non-pandemic environment have questions about of an absentee ballot voting by mail, because we don't know, I can fill out the ballot and somebody can help me fill it out, or watch me fill it out, or force me to fill it out the same way. I may choose to do that, in front of somebody else, or I may be forced to, or be bought to do so. So there are some concerns, and that's why when you're in the middle of a pandemic, we have other concerns that we heard from the very first speaker about some of the health concerns. So you're trying to balance all these things. The good news is there are a lot of resources, a lot of states that are willing to help states to try to ramp up to do this stuff at scale, but it's hard. And the states that have a lot more vote by mail, like a Colorado, like Oregon and other states, gradually move that way. So what we're experiencing right now is a dramatic shift. It's hard. And that's where in Kentucky, we're really glad that we can do this for a primary. We know we'll have lower turnout. We have a US Senate primary, but neither the Democratic primary nor the Republican primary are all that competitive. We only have one competitive congressional primary. We have some competitive legislative races, but we don't anticipate a very high turnout. Well, that lower turnout will help us learn how to run this election. And then if we need to apply those lessons in the fall, it'll be better. But we don't anticipate a mess like Wisconsin or Ohio, because we've had more time to deal with it. But we don't anticipate, people waking up the next day with this, oh my gosh, that was such a smooth election. You have to be realistic. And this is where, again, elected officials, policymakers, advocacy groups, we need to be communicate clearly what the rules are, what the expectations are, and how we can all help. So hopefully that gets at some of the questions. I'm happy to answer more of those offline, but those are some really good questions. But this can be done, but it is hard to do it very, this quickly and expect a flawless election.
Well, thank you so much for that. A quick follow-up. You mentioned the Colorado system and the tracking system. We've got a question from one of our participants about costs. And so I'm not sure that any of us can, one of the questions is, how much does the Colorado tracking system cost? And, is this something that we could copy in Tennessee? So I'll start, Secretary Grayson, and then if you can fill in as well. I can't speak to the cost of the tracking system in Colorado, but one of the things that we think a lot about is what is possible in the state with the amount of time that we've got to go before the primary in August and the general, of course, in November. And the good news is, I don't think that anybody on this call is advocating for Tennessee to immediately move to the sort of system that they have in Colorado, which is vote by mail and tracking and sort of all the bells and whistles that go along with that. We're thinking just about temporarily expanding a system that we already have. So we already make absentee ballots available to some voters. We're really talking about sort of a right size solution for our state, which is, expanding the absentee voting system just to make that available to all registered voters instead of some. But Secretary Grayson, if you've got more thoughts on that too, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I don't have specific thoughts, but one thing that happens when you do more vote by mail, when you have more absentee voting, is you change how you allocate your election costs. In the short run, and especially in the middle of a pandemic, it's going to cost more because you're going to have a lot of redundancies. You're going to have, because you don't know how many people are going to vote by mail. You don't know how many people are going to vote early or on election day. Over time, you figure that out. And so what we've seen in states that have changed their allocation, Florida, for example, votes a third in person on election day, roughly a third in person early in advance of election day, like Tennessee has, and then roughly a third by mail. That's in the normal election. And so when you have fewer people voting on election day, you can have fewer places to go vote. Tennessee, I know, has had a pretty good experience with convenience vote centers. You can do more things like that and then maybe allocate more of those costs to pay for more people to help count absentee ballots as they're coming in, to pay for the software systems, to pay for the scanners and things like that. But it is a challenge, not just to communicate to voters how this works, but to just allocate in the budget. Over time, it might be cheaper in the grand scheme of things, on an annual ongoing basis, if you didn't have an election day. I'm not advocating for that. In fact, I'm not a huge fan of vote by mail, except in the middle of a pandemic. And so that's why I'm a fan right now, because we need to do it. I wouldn't advocate for that for Kentucky. I'll let Tennessee make its own decisions. But you can change how you do how elections the expenditures take place, and that can help to pay for things. And that's where this federal money is nice, because it's one-time dollars that you can keep. And so it allows you to make some of these transitions or do some of the, pay for some of these emergency expenses. And this is an emergency.
It sure is an emergency. Dr. Jahangir, we've got a question for you. Could the public health situation look even worse in November? And will social distancing still be a good way to combat it?
Well, so I think the big worry is a second wave, right? I think a lot of places have done a great job at narrowing or flattening the curve and minimizing things, but second waves do happen. You see that already happening in Asia and other places. Social distancing and wearing masks do help. I mean, there's a recent study out of Berkeley that showed that if 80% of a population wears just normal cloth masks, it drops the infection rate by 1/12 or to 1/12 of whatever infection rate would have happened. But I also think we need to be realistic and know that complacency happens and lack of people following along happens. And so, again, as I mentioned in my remarks, the new normal will be something that we'll have to live with for 18 to 24 months. And so it is important to have these other alternatives for everything to do in life, whether it's going to the grocery store or voting. So I think the second wave typically will follow. I think the big worry is the same time around the flu season this year, which is around the October-November timeframe. So we have to think through that. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Secretary Grayson, we've got a question from Matt with State Line News. So what do you think of Republican lawmakers in other states who either passed new legislation to restrict voter access during a pandemic? And he cites Oklahoma's new voter ID requirements as an example. Or folks who have refused to expand no excuse absentee before November. Experts say states are running out of time to make changes to election laws. Should those Republicans rethink their stance and act? That's from Matt.
Sure. So, I mean, first, if you ask any election administrator, they prefer to operate in a world where there are no law changes that take effect immediately upon passage. And so you have some time to phase them in, to develop the necessary procedures or protocols. We always tried to minimize changes that we were proposing, and especially in a presidential year, in the November presidential year, even in non-battleground states, which Kentucky and Tennessee are non-battleground states in the presidential race, where you have lower turnout. It's still the highest turnout you're going to have in the 4-year cycle. So I'm not a big fan of changes. Again, we're in the middle of a pandemic that requires some changes. It's not an ideal world. Let me put my Republican hat on for a second, and maybe not, and I'll put on my election administrator hat. I'll answer this question 2 different ways. So as a Republican, I get frustrated by this in a couple of ways. One, the Republican Party's base right now skews older, and older voters are the ones who are most at risk with coming to a precinct, to a crowded location. Again, on election day in a presidential year is a crowded location. So we're hurting the ability of our own voters to vote. So I find just kind of as a pure partisan, I find that this is really an unfortunate policy. And the survey data that shows that Republicans aren't supportive of it, that's just not in the Republican Party's best interest. I'd also get frustrated as a Republican because I think it's a way, some people who see the party makes decisions like that think, oh, they don't want people to vote. And I think we can win elections, and let's have at it. There was a big study that the Knight Foundation issued a couple weeks ago that showed the folks who don't vote are not clearly Democrats, are not clearly Republicans. And so the data doesn't show that vote by mail favors one party or another. The data doesn't show that non-voters are favor one party over another. And so I think the Republicans are from a partisan standpoint, aren't doing some wise things. And our party is often really good at running campaigns in states that allow absentee voting with, vote by mail and in person and things like that. So now as an election administrator, and then the other side of this Republican thing is I also get frustrated. The Democrats in Washington just proposed a big stimulus package to go after the pandemic. And in that, they put a bunch of permanent election changes that aren't needed to attack this pandemic. And they would be permanent changes to elections. And so when Republicans see this, they see the Democrats trying to nationalize elections and use this as an excuse to do things. And so both sides really frustrate me. I'm still Republican. I'm still, this is my pivoting back to my election administrator. I get frustrated about both sides. I think it gets politicized. Too many Democrats say, let's have vote by mail, win more elections. Well, one, as I said, the data doesn't show that. And two, even if the data did show that, how are you going to get Republicans to pass those laws, adopt those policies if they think they're going to lose more elections because you assert this? So the strategy is really, really frustrating. So it bothers me on whatever hat I'm wearing, the election administrator hat or the Secretary of State Republican hat. We're in a pandemic. We got to think differently. We have to work together. I'm glad our governor and Secretary of State and our legislature set aside a fight they were having on other things and came together on this issue. Now, I don't know what we're going to do in November, but we've got some time to deal with that. But I really appreciate their leadership, and that's in the contrast to what we've seen in some other states.
Jeff, we've got a question for you. Can you talk a bit more about why we see higher levels of support for that temporary change that Secretary Grayson just mentioned? And wondering if that's an opportunity to get some things done legislatively, maybe on a temporary basis.
Yeah, well, I think that is exactly what Secretary of State Grayson is talking about, both from his own personal, I think, view and also from what we're hearing. I think it's a little bit more on the Republican side is sort of an acknowledgement, yes, let's not, we can make this adjustment for this election because of the situation that we're in, and then we can see how it works. And, we don't have to radically change everything here on out, but we do need to be, people really do see that we're in a unique time, and people in all walks of life are adjusting how you eat, where you eat, who you visit, who you can see. And to run elections the same way and pretend like nothing is different is just wrongheaded, and you're going to put people at risk, and you're going to disenfranchise people. So I think there is an acknowledgement that yes, at least whether this is something that changes after this or not, for this election, we do need to make a change.
We've got a question about sort of local election administrations. The question's about the power of local election commissions to expand absentee voting this year and expand voting access. I think the writer's looking for ways to make some change without necessarily going through the General Assembly. And so I can take that a little bit, and then y'all please fill in too. So even if the General Assembly doesn't expand access to absentee voting this year, there are, of course, still are voters in Tennessee who are eligible to take advantage of our absentee voting system. So folks, for instance, who are age 60 and up, anybody on jury duty, anybody who's out of the country, some folks with an illness that would prevent them from getting to the polls. So local election commissions cannot sort of independently decide we're going to let more folks use absentee ballots, but they can do everything that they're able to do to make sure that folks who are eligible get access to those absentee ballots. So I know here in Davidson County, registered voters got a mailing that informed all of us, how we can access absentee ballots. And there was, I think, even an application form for those who are eligible. So there's lots that can happen. And Secretary Grayson, you mentioned this in your remarks at the top too. Even if we don't see legislative change this year, we don't see that expansion, there's still a lot both that election commissions can and I think will do for folks who are already eligible. And then also a role for all the civic engagement groups in the state to go out and make sure that they're helping the folks who are eligible get access to absentee ballots. Secretary, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, a couple things that I would add is my understanding in Tennessee, and this is certainly true in Kentucky, that the local election administrators or commissions have the ability to increase the number of days for the in-person early voting. And so by having more days and a longer window than maybe they would traditionally have, that can help stretch that election day vote out into multiple days, thus reducing the crowds. It would, social distancing would be easier if you were, instead of doing it over 2 weeks, if you're doing it over 4 weeks or something like that. So more hours, more days, maybe different locations. That can be, you can put a polling place in some place you're going to have to. Some of the polling places are in nursing homes. Schools probably are still okay, but there are some other senior citizen centers or another popular place. Maybe we don't want them there either. So in the process of moving them around, you have the ability to put them into better spots. But I think that stretching the early voting window out, putting the precincts in different kinds of places. Those are some things we can do. And then I think clearly communicating, as you said, people aren't always aware of the ability that you have right now to vote absentee. And so making sure that everybody over 60 knows that they have the ability to do that, because some people might hear something like, oh, senior citizens can vote absentee. Well, what is a senior citizen? Well, in Tennessee, it's over 60, and that's a large percentage of the vote. And so, and then also with that poll worker recruitment, if you have more poll workers available, then you can have more voting places, which will then decrease the crowd size on the days where in-person elections are taking place. So there's things you can do to try to work within the laws as they are, and hopefully people in Tennessee will take advantage of those.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of our participants, to all of the, more than 100 folks who hopped on. I think we got pretty close to 150 there by the end. So thank you to all the participants, this great group of panelists. Again, for the media on the call, if you've got follow-up questions, please reach out to me, Shauna, at thinktn.org. I'd be happy to connect you with our speakers. Thank you to everybody for taking the time. And we look forward to more conversations like this in the future. Thank you.